So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew Evans. I'm Director of Markets at techUK, and I'm going to be acting as chair today in a slightly unusual format. So welcome to the launch event of Taking Forward the Gigabit Broadband Network in the UK report, which we're delighted to be hosting this afternoon's event on behalf of Assembly and Huawei, who have helped pull this report together. And I think it's going to be an important contribution in how we devise the policy and regulatory framework for deploying gigabit networks in the UK going forward. So you're going to hear from a number of speakers, and we'll have a panel debate at the end. So if you can keep your questions to the end. Housekeeping is going to be relatively light, as you would expect. But just to emphasize, all attendees are sort of joined this event on mute. So if you can keep on mute until, particularly if you're a speaker, it's your turn to contribute. That would just help reduce background noise. And if you've got any questions throughout the session, if you can drop them into the chat channel, then I promise I will make sure that I come to you and address your question during the Q&A. So hopefully, and you should also, by the way, in the chat channel, be able to see a link to the report, which has just been published today. So as I said, we've got really good list of speakers today, so we will turn over to them to get started. So without further ado, I should mention as well, we are being recorded. We will, if any of the clips, including you, are being used, we will come back to you for further confirmation on that. So without further ado, Julian, do you want to give the first opening introduction, please?
Yes, thanks very much, Matt. I have to say, you're starting to look as if you could get a job on the BBC or Channel 4 as a presenter, Matt. But, very, very thorough. So look, welcome everyone. This is called Taking Forward the Gigabit Broadband Network across the UK. And as Matt said, it's a report sponsored by Huawei, one of our members, and it's been created by Assembly Research. I'm the CEO at techUK. Many of you on this call will be members, but if you're not, then techUK is the membership organisation of private sector companies, and it brings together people, companies and organisations to realise the positive outcomes from digital technology. During this time, we're continuously working with businesses, government, stakeholders to fulfil the potential of that technology, obviously to deliver a stronger society and at this all time, a more sustainable future. So what we try to do is provide expertise and insight, which comes ultimately, of course, from our member companies, but to support members, partners, and very importantly, stakeholders as they prepare the UK for what comes next. And that's very much a theme of what techUK is about, both this year and as we see it going forward into the digital decade to come. I think it's fair to say that none of us sort of anticipated the changes that have happened to the world so far. Oil prices, far from being unaffordable and over $100, actually people being paid to take oil from producers last week. So it just shows the value and the importance of resilience across companies, particularly the public sector and healthcare, but also just shows again the real importance of the digital fabric that underpins so much of our modern day life. And it's that issue of resilience that I want to make a theme of my opening remarks, and I'm sure will be hugely significant both in the discussion of the report, but also the panel session, which can be wider. And I think everybody knows connectivity has been the crucial thing. I mean, Rory Kaplan-Jones wrote a blog a little while ago saying, imagine if we were dealing with this crisis either here in the UK or globally 10 or 15 years ago without the infrastructure that has been implemented by companies such as those on the panel today, with equipment provided by companies such as Huawei. Telecoms have helped provide services to the NHS front line. They've kept the economy moving as much as possible. And certainly what we've seen is those companies that are digital and based on digital infrastructure are the ones that are able to continue to function. Others that didn't get to that point are the ones with the biggest challenges. But most importantly, of course, what technology is doing is ensuring that the most vulnerable of our society are being physically shielded but still socially connected. If you look at the NHS, thousands of tech devices, including smartphones, portable video calling screens, tablets, have been donated to or implemented in the NHS for staff to use. For example, in the recently opened Nightingale hospitals and across care homes in several locations. This ensures people can stay connected and supports the NHS and social care system. In business, as we are demonstrating with this very cool video conference calls have surged, so most of us who can are working from home. And platforms such as Zoom or Microsoft Teams and others, they've seen huge increases in their usage globally. And it allows us and techUK, where we've traditionally been very much a visitor-based organisation with 23,000 visitors coming to St Bride Street, move that whole effort and all the things that we do online so that we're still able to deliver just as much engagement with our members and with stakeholders as we were before. They've also proved the resilience of cloud-based platforms. Remember, again, it wasn't so long ago, there were questions about cloud. Could we trust it? Is it reliable? Etc., etc. And that's been proven beyond doubt. And to support this, the UK's major internet service and mobile providers have actually come together to ensure people are connected, many offers to help people extending data offerings, etc., etc. And that has allowed people to take advantage of these generous mobile and landline packages to stay connected, and also to allow us to work out the priority repairs for fixed broadband and landlines. And if you remember back at the start of this crisis, there were quite a few newspaper headlines where they were saying, oh, the internet's going to fall over, it won't be able to cope. And networks have been able to cope. They have been able to collaborate, and different parts of the ecosystem have been able to make the sensible adjustments to be resilient to what is a mass change in usage patterns. Again, I'm sure this is going to come out in the discussion, the change of time of day and types of usage that are being used. Well, of course, as well as helping with the response and with the adaptation to the COVID-19 crisis, gigabit networks are going to be essential to recovering our economy and to supercharging that recovery, which will be needed here and around the world. And at the moment, the investment risk in digital infrastructure is being borne overwhelmingly by the private sector. These investments are necessary for levelling up the UK, very important agenda, which will not go away, will only be more emphasised, we believe, by the current crisis, and for laying the vital groundwork for productivity and economic growth across the country. If there is practically any delay to achieving full coverage of gigabit broadband, we believe the UK could potentially miss out on between 10 and 30 billion of productivity benefits, and you'll see that very clearly in the report. But a full gigabit broadband rollout by 2025 could boost the economy on the other side of the coin by over 13 billion by 2025. The ability to earn and learn new skills would boost average pay by over £3,500. So a connected society is more likely to be productive, happier, more innovative, able to adapt to challenges such as the one we have. And we see that as a multiplier effect for both individuals and businesses. Accelerated rollout of 5G also shows a positive picture for regional growth, which would provide opportunities outside the usual technology hubs, London, but we do see London getting a huge increase in business revenue, the South East, equally very large, but also to the Northwest with 1.5 billion potentially on offer, the East of England, 1.3 billion potentially on offer, and over 1 billion in the Southwest, and there are other regions that will benefit as well. And it shows that 5G development is not an initiative that just benefits a small area of the country, but it actually will help the economy be more resilient up and down the country, contributing to that levelling up. Now, we know at the moment that that's not the case. Many organisations do not open or at least expand in places with poor poor connectivity due to this very reason. The UK needs to have a level playing field. So we need to remove the barriers to telecom deployment. And whilst the private sector is investing the majority of what is required, clearly government has a critical role. First, in playing a facilitative role, better known as barrier busting. I think it was Matt Howett who coined that phrase back in the day. Ensuring that it's cheap, quick and easy to deploy infrastructure as quick as possible. Secondly, there are clearly areas where the business case for private sector deployment do not stack up. Here, government needs to bring forward detailed plans for the $5 billion that it is committed to invest. Now, more than is spent needs to be scrutinised, and $5 billion is and sounds a significant amount. But it's roughly the annual amount we spend on roads in the UK each year, and that's really a maintenance and an addition point where we're talking about transformation. So we think government needs to acknowledge the strategic importance of this infrastructure and actually switch and pull out all the stops to help its deployment. Speed up, indeed. And there are policy recommendations specifically focused on that in the report. They need to support the businesses investing in the deployment of these networks by providing policy and regulatory certainty. We've had too much in the past where policies have been either contradictory or indeed somewhat delaying things and actually making investment decisions harder to adopt at speed and at scale. We need to expedite access to public sector land and buildings. We need to ensure sustainable supply chains. We need to make sure businesses have access to the people and skills they need to build networks at scale and pace. So we welcome the government's agreements of the shared rural network, which will be a huge improvement for people across the country in rural areas, and will help take 4G coverage to 95% of UK landmass by the end of 2025. This agreement will help spur economic growth, close the digital divide across the country through better connectivity. Look, I shouldn't finish this introduction without also taking the opportunity to say thank you to everyone in the telecom sector, from engineers to customer care teams, for everything they do to keep us connected, particularly given some of the recent foolish, indeed mad, conspiracy theories and the attacks. We think they're all hashtag network heroes, so thanks to them. And we'll find during this lockdown that 5G and full fibre are absolutely essential to assuring that our economy and society are resilient enough to adapt, to overcome any challenges that we are faced with, and to help supercharge the recovery. But of course, it will require a lot of hard work and a lot of clear thinking and clear policy recommendations. And I want to close by thanking Huawei and Assembly for such a powerful contribution to that effort, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion. Thank you all very much. Back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Julian. I think you've provided us a decent framework to talk about the report and take us forward during this discussion. Victor, do you want to say a couple of words now, please?
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the launch of Gigabit Britain. So I would particularly like to thank Julia, Matt, and the panel for taking your time to share your thoughts and reflections on this paper. Firstly, I hope everyone and your families are well and staying safe during this difficult time. It has been truly inspiring to see how everyone is pulling together and doing what they can to help friends, family, and communities get through this. At Huawei, we stand ready to do whatever we can to help employees, customers, and the public. As well as the considerable human toll, it is clearer than ever the coronavirus is going to have a substantial and a long-term impact on world economies. So today, I think it is important to look to the other side of this devastating pandemic. One level that will be to consider how we can help the global recovery. This is a comprehensive paper done by Assembly Research. The idea was to encourage debate about how best to transform Britain into a country with a modern, ultra-fast digital infrastructure. So we wanted to explore the many benefits, such as the economic development and environmental progress the gigabit connectivity delivers, as well as the stark reality of how much a delay would cost. In doing so, this paper provides excellent policy recommendations for the UK government. But as the world changed, so too did much of the focus of Assembly's work. This report also now takes a considerate look at how driving forward connectivity will help the UK's economic recovery in the aftermath of COVID-19. This timely research shows that investing in next generation networks will be one of the key factors in driving a return to economic growth in the UK. But it's in the form of full fiber broadband or 5G networks. What this paper makes clear is that enhancing British connections will be critical and to ensuring a rapid recovery. In fact, it shows that more than £50 billion would be added to the UK economy in 5 years, and nearly £70 billion in the next decade. These are significant numbers and underline the importance of good connectivity. This independent research highlights the substantial contribution the new technologies will make. So if we can help to make sure this disruption is V-shaped with only a short interruption to British economic progress, then doing so is not a choice, it is essential. If we are to ensure that we supercharge Britain's return to the growth in the aftermath of the coronavirus lockdown, it is right for us to recommit ourselves to this ambitious vision and continue to build British leadership in the digital era. As this paper makes clear, investing in innovation in the broadband network is the most effective and energy efficient way to drive a rapid economic recovery as Britain gets back to work. And Huawei is here and ready to play its part to help where we can. Thank you very much again. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Victor. And for the eagle-eyed amongst you on the agenda, you will see that as soon as Julian complimented me, clearly I messed up the order immediately after that. So now we'll come to Matt, author of the report. Again, to everyone else, if you have a question and you just want to make a note of it, you can drop it into the chat and I will come to you during the live Q&A. So Matt, finally, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt. Thanks, Julian, and thank you to Victor as well. We are naturally very pleased to be able to present this report to you today. Obviously, we're doing it in very different circumstances, I think, to what we envisaged. Certainly, this report was conceived at a time where coronavirus wasn't even known about. So we've had to shift things slightly in order to respond to what we've seen unfold before us. But I think, as Victor said, what it has done is highlighted just how important the connectivity is to Britain. And we've all benefited that through the way we've been able to work from home, but also been able to stay in touch with our families and our friends during this strange time. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with you because what I wanted to do was just give you an overview of the report that we've put together and some of the key messages that we have found as part of this research. Actually, I don't think I can because it's saying I don't have the permission enabled, and I'd have to restart Zoom. So we won't do that. But all I had on those 2 slides were the 6 recommendations that we've made as part of this this research. And I think what I would start with saying is that often people joke that if you could roll out broadband using reports and inquiries, then the UK would probably have some of the fastest broadband in the world. I'm going to say this time that actually I think that's not true. This is a very important contribution to the debate because we very much focus on what it is Britain needs to do to get moving. I think we all now accept the target that has been given, but we need to know what we need to do practically over the next few years to actually make it happen. So the first recommendation that we make is a commitment to that target that the government have put in place, which is to bring gigabit connectivity to the whole of the UK by 2025. Obviously, we're not starting from zero. The UK has made significant progress on rollout of superfast. We've got more than 95% coverage of that, and it's going to grow close to 100% very soon. So we've got to remember that we're not starting at the beginning. I think also the regulator Ofcom have made considerable progress with the regulatory environment for gigabit connectivity, and there's been a lot of encouragement around the work and the framework that Ofcom have put in place. And I think we need to build on that positive progress with the regulatory environment that has been made. The attention now, of course, turns more to the policymaker, and I think that's what the focus of this report is. It's looking at what the government can do to ensure that we can meet that target. So the second recommendation as part of that is that we really do believe that it's important to keep a technology neutral approach to the target. I mean, anyone who has followed this debate will have remembered at first that this target was defined as being full fibre only. And I think a lot of us almost fell off our chairs when we thought, could we do this by 2025? Probably not was the answer. Some people called it a fudge to include Virgin Media's cable footprint and to include the 4G and 5G network deployments from the mobile side. But I think in reality, if we want to achieve this target of 2025, we need to consider the whole sort of fabric of technology that exists in Britain. And that includes the cable network, and it includes the mobile network too. So maintaining that technology neutral approach is very important, not least because it will get us there that much quicker, but also more cost effectively. And ultimately, I think we've got to remember, do consumers really care what the underlying technology is if it can deliver what it is that they're looking to do with the service? The third thing that we say to policymakers is that it's important to support the entry of alternative network operators. We've seen this very much being a priority and focus of Ofcom's thinking. They have made many times the commitment to ensure that the footprint is not just the incumbents that we're used to, but actually it's going to be driven by a degree of infrastructure competition between competing providers. And I think we're already starting to see the fruits of that approach. We've seen Openreach commit to go that much further with its rollout. We've seen whole new companies grow and flourish as a result of this that are deploying significantly across Britain, and we include some of the rollouts of those operators in our reports. So operators like City Fibre, Hyperoptic, GigaClear, to name but a few. And I think what that has done has spurred others on to increase the rollout. It's increased awareness amongst consumers of the connectivity that exists in Britain. But it has also, I think, improve the relationship with the retail service providers as well. They're doing better deals with those wholesale only network operators, which ultimately will benefit consumers when it comes to take up and the services that they're going to use on top of those networks. We do say that whilst we really think this approach has been the right one, it's obviously not going to work across the whole of the country. There will be parts of the country where it just won't be economic to go for some people at all, and also where competition between those providers will be more limited. And so we've got to make sure that the regulator gets it right with the environment in those places, but also puts in place alternatives so that nobody is left behind, either because there will be no competition in those areas or because there is no coverage at all, which is why we go on in recommendation 4 to ensure that there is sufficient funding and well-targeted intervention for those non-commercial areas. You know, I think it's been quite encouraging that the government have already made available this 5 billion to serve those parts of the country where this competitive approach isn't going to work. But I think history has told us, you know, that funding has never been enough. It's obviously a very welcome contribution, but if you think about the scale of the connectivity challenge, you know, 30 billion is one estimate to do this. It is a sort of modest amount in comparison, particularly when we're talking about the most expensive and hard to reach parts of the country. So we need to make sure that that is just the beginning of any subsidy that the government can make, and also to make sure that it's spent in a wise way. Whether that is through extending voucher schemes that have worked particularly well for superfast, or whether it's through funding more research into getting 5G into practical use cases in those parts of the country. And the report makes some comparisons with other markets where governments have looked at this and have put in place various sorts of initiatives in order to spend that public subsidy wisely. The fifth recommendation, and I think maybe the most important one for me as part of the report, is what government should be doing in terms of removing the barriers to deployment. So referencing what Julian said with the barrier busting task force. You know, that was a very catchy name for a department of government, but have we seen enough from it? You know, are they really knocking down those barriers that the operators need to be removed to get on with that commercial rollout and footprint? I think we all thought 2025 was a long way off. So we didn't maybe need to think about, you know, getting to work straight away on some of those, but it's clear that it's going to take a couple of years at least in order to get those planning reforms needed to be done, to make it more cost effective for the private sector to deploy, whether it's through reforming business rates as one example. You know, these are the sort of things that need to be happening now in government in order to make sure that the operators can start lifting the spades and digging the trenches to put fibre in and to enable the base stations to ensure more 5G coverage. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, and it needs to be started quickly in order for us to meet that target. And in the report, we talk about a whole range of different barriers that we think need to be removed, and these are as a result of discussions and interviews that we've done with stakeholders, and I think there's a lot of agreement around the ones that we've included as part of the report. Related to that, I think it's also worth saying that, you know, the UK is not the first country to move on gigabit connectivity. You know, there are other countries that often get held up as having more fibre, more 5G than us. And it's important not just to worry about where we sit in the league table, but also to try and learn from those countries. What is it that they did particularly well with removing some of those barriers? And that's what we've tried to capture as part of that part of the report, to sort of give policymakers some ideas about how it's worked particularly well in other markets where connectivity in terms of fibre and 5G might be higher than in the UK. The final recommendation that we make as part of the report is not to just obsess with the supply side when it comes to broadband policy. You know, too often we talk about, you know, the enabling work, the digging, the putting up of masts, but at the end of the day, these networks are only ever going to be successful if there are consumers and businesses wanting to make use of them. And so there is, I think, more work that needs to be done to focus on the demand side, to encourage take-up, and to help lower the investment risk for the operators. And I think government have a very important role to play as part of this. You know, the government can be a big demand aggregator when it comes to these networks, moving more services online. We've seen the government struggle a little bit during this pandemic with even, you know, video conferencing. So it gives us a bit of a concern that they're not yet ready when it comes to demand side, which is why in the report we've looked at countries in Asia, countries like China, Korea, and Japan, where the government has sort of done more of a sort of joined up approach when it comes to policy, and it includes always that demand element. So we'd like to see more focus on demand and encouraging people to use these networks so that it is that much easier for the commercial operators to deploy. So there's quite a lot in there for you to have a look at. I hope that I've summarized it reasonably well as part of this. I think the key takeaway for me is that there is an incredible prize on the table, and Victor mentioned that with us having looked at some of the economic benefits that can be attributed to getting gigabit connectivity on time. And also that we're not starting from scratch. You know, we have a solid foundation, a lot to build on. We're all committed to it. The industry stands ready to meet the target. We just need those few things removed so that the operators can feel confident that they can achieve that target for Britain. And we all know what the benefits of that could be. So thank you for giving me a chance to give you a summary of the research. I think it's a fantastic panel ahead of us, and look forward to any questions. So back over to you, Matt.
Thanks very much, Matt. And as I said to everyone, if you've got questions, please do drop them into the chat, and I'll make sure that we come to you during the Q&A. There's also a link to the full report with the recommendations that Matt has just outlined in the chat function as well. So up next, we have one of those infrastructure builders that we've been talking about so far today. So Alex Blowers from City Fibre, if you can unmute yourself, please, and we will come to you.
Thanks. Excuse me. Thank you, Matt. I'm not sure what to say actually after that comprehensive overview of the report, which actually says many of the things that I was planning to say. So let me try and find some slightly different or additional points to make. I mean, I think let's start with the situation that we all find ourselves in right now. I mean, I think I've been pleasantly surprised at the firm grip that the government has had throughout the COVID crisis and the priority that it's given to maintaining and extending the footprint of digital networks. So the good news, I think, is right now we are not in a state of total disarray, scrambling for to restore some form of business as usual. I think actually we are well placed as an industry, and certainly City Fibre is well placed as a firm, to emerge quite quickly from this crisis and really to get back on track to start to really ramp up the build program for full fibre. In some ways, therefore, and this may sound premature, but I think our first and most immediate point that we would make right now is that it's really important for government, and in particular the regulator, to get back on the horse as quickly as possible, executing the various plans and policy initiatives that were starting to be put in place before all of this current crisis hit. So I'm thinking here particularly of Ofcom's work to put in place its regulatory framework for 2021 to 2026, which I think, as others have already commented, is really putting us now in a much better place in terms of having a regulatory framework that will genuinely create the right preconditions for mass rollout of advanced networks. I think also it's worth saying that although we have some very clear and energetic statements of intent from government, we don't really have a plan as yet, to my mind at least, for an execution plan, if you will, for 2025. And that, I think, is becoming increasingly urgent. It's more urgent now than it was before. What I mean by that is, I think we all know that the pre-existing target of full fibre everywhere by 2033 was going to be quite challenging. 2025 shaves 8 years off the timescale. We have some interesting ideas in circulation, the so-called outside-in programme to subsidise rollout in rural, for instance. But I don't yet see a single coherent statement of intent that stitches that plan together with other measures, such as the ones that Matt was referring to around a beefed up version of a barrier busting plan. So the barrier busting initiatives, which are currently passing through Parliament, are a good start, but I think everybody in the industry would say they barely scratch the surface of the issues that we would require to be addressed and move forward in order to really be on track to deliver everything everywhere by 2025. One other comment I would make is that I think I understand the political imperative to focus on rural right now. And I think one of the things that we've heard said is that the government's particularly keen that those who currently have the worst broadband experience should be first in line for any publicly supported rollout of gigabit connectivity. I think that's fine that makes perfect sense to me as a political imperative. What it does mean is that there's a slight risk of a gap emerging between the market-led deployments and the outside-in programme. And that's what we have always called throughout this process the missing middle problem. Now, to put this in very political terms, the kinds of places that we see potentially losing out in the missing middle scenario are the red wall constituencies that lent their votes to the Conservatives in the last election, have in many cases, if you look at those constituencies, a particular spatial distribution which makes them not particularly attractive for commercial deployment, but probably not so unattractive as likely to be first in the queue for the gap funding that the government's contemplating. So if I was sat in number 10 right now, I think one of the challenges I would be setting to officials is, what can you tell me is a credible plan to deliver full fibre connectivity for places like Blythe Valley, Worksop, South Yorkshire, North Derbyshire, the sorts of places which have traditionally been at the end of the queue for advanced connectivity improvements. So that, I think, is one thing that we're keen to pick up again with the government. And I would say that the answer to that is not necessarily extending the subsidy available, but maybe to look at more creative solutions. It's very interesting that on the wireless side, there's been an extensive discussion about a shared rural network, but similar ideas of co-investment or collaborative approaches on the fixed side really up to now have not gone anywhere. They've not really taken off. And that's one of the things that I think we're keen to see encouraged. I want to say something also about a point that Matt was making on the demand side. So I absolutely agree that one of the most powerful levers for accelerating rollout is a smart use of the public sector's own procurement budgets. So it's noticeable from our experience that local authorities generally have been on the journey towards upgrading their connectivity over the last 5 years. We would like to see that stimulus maintained. So we've had something called the Local Full Fibre Network Programme, which is now winding down. And we're asking the government to put in place something which replaces that to create the right framework of incentive for local authorities and also other big public sector procurement bodies like NHSX to get on a framework that will mean that their budgets are also contributing to the full fibre rollout target. And I think the other aspect of the demand side, and those who've heard me witter on about this issue at great length in other forums will not be surprised to hear me say this, is we also need to address the continued customer confusion about what it is that we're actually selling here. So our experience on the ground as we roll out our full fibre networks is many customers will come out, potential customers I should say, will come out of their houses as we pass and say, I don't know why you're digging up my street, and by the way, you're blocking my car in, because I've already got full fibre. I've had it for the last 2.5 years. And we say, well, no, you haven't, because ours is the first full fibre network in your area. And they say, well, that can't be right, because I've got the ultimate fibre, or I've got the, you know, the best in class full fibre, and I can show you the advertising collateral that proves that. So we still believe that the missing part of this, along with all of the excellent efforts that have been made to get the supply side conditions right, is to look much more rigorously at the demand side conditions, and in particular how we can get consumers on that journey. At the moment, the only part of that story that's getting any attention is forced migration off copper onto fibre, which for me is the long stop that you would have in place if you couldn't have the right, if you didn't have the right structures in place to encourage voluntary migration from copper onto fibre. Before we start forcing people to do anything, let's try and give them the right tools to navigate their way away from their legacy technology onto the new technology. So I think those are the key points. The one issue that I've sidestepped in my comments is, what should the target be? Should it be, as Matt suggests, technology neutral gigabit connectivity, or should it be a target more about full fibre? I think the answer is the ship has sailed, and we've now got a gigabit connectivity target. But I question the assumption that much of what needs to be built to extend the footprint of connectivity is going to be anything other than full fibre. Having looked at this question quite a lot in the last year and a half, I remain sceptical that actually we'll end up building much that isn't full fibre in order to bridge the connectivity gap. But I think that's an issue that others will have different views on, and it would be good to have a discussion about. So I think I've just about kept to time there, Matt.
We can certainly come on to the full fibre gigabit question in the panel, I'm sure. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Simon from Cambridge Wireless, who will give us probably a bit of a different flavour and overview of gigabit connectivity. Simon, over to you.
Yeah, possibly, Matt, thank you. I'm actually going to pick up on a few points that Alex and Julian had already mentioned, and Matt mentioned in his report. And it's really about the demand side for this. And we've seen a change in Cambridge Wireless over the last few years. You know, it was always a technology-driven membership organisation. And actually what we have seen is the increasing number of large kind of verticals joining up. And what that is that as connectivity has become more ubiquitous, and there's a certain set of technologies around IoT, edge data, sensor technology have really taken a hold in industry, then we're seeing this interest in connectivity being continually driven. And I think that's one of the points that I'd like to make. And I think also it's worth thinking that, you know, it took probably 100 years to get copper into every home. And now we're setting a target of 2025 to get fibre into every home. So, you know, 5 years. And, you know, of those homes, 50% of them still get their internet from what you could probably consider to be early 20th century technology. You know, it used to be state of the art, but it's not now. The other half provided for or supplied by HFC, so hybrid fibre coaxial cables. And actually broadly, people are generally happy. So the public seem to be generally happy. I mean, in an ideal world, you'd have full fibre. You know, we all know it's better. We know that it endures the environment a lot better. You know, you have less problems with water, heat, cold, these types of things. Fibre is better for you in terms of faults, over the use of copper. It's cheaper to roll out. It's largely passive. It doesn't require energy in the way that a copper network does. So environmentally, it's a better solution, and it's more consistent, which means that the MNOs and the data providers can start charging tariffs that people understand, because you're going to get consistency of delivery. So full fibre is a really interesting thing, but if 95% of people are broadly happy with what they've got, then you have to look at the other side of the market. And if we think that 95% of the market here, if we compare us to Europe, for example, we are the highest on super fast broadband in the EU5, but we're the lowest on full fibre. Now, the comparisons with other countries are sometimes useful, sometimes not. Your population density is a massive factor in that. But actually, you probably have to consider that, given the way that the UK is put together, then actually we've probably not done a bad job of exploiting the copper networks using the advanced signal processing techniques that we're using at the moment. So my point in saying this, and it goes back to what Alex was saying, is that if supply and demand should dictate, then why does the government need to intervene? And I think it was Matt made the point that actually the general public probably don't know what they've got as well, and they're broadly satisfied with it. They're not going to see huge changes, whereas industry will. And I think that's the point of the government intervention in this. If you do need to intervene in a market, why do you do it? And a government might intervene because there's an imbalance in the market, or it might be that monopolies aren't investing enough. And so, the government will come in and make some changes. So I think this is more about the development of technology. I think there are real roadblocks to getting full fibre into people's houses. You've got to drill a lot of holes, and you've got to drill them all over again to do that. And that's a challenge. So for me, it's not necessarily full fibre into people's houses that will make the massive difference here. But I think it's this connectivity network that then will affect industry, and they'll be driving it. And the products that the businesses make will then bring the general public round. So I see the demand in a slightly different place. And I think the key thing for me is the time saver, the key drivers are time savers for industry, but also that ability to innovate. And that, in the UK, that's the thing that we're absolutely fantastic at. We see small companies and startups within our network innovating, developing products, collaborating with vertical markets, vertical companies. And I think that is really where the real advantage is. And that's where I'd like to see the government intervene. So I won't say any more because I'm conscious of time, but that would be my view.
Okay, thanks, Simon, and good to have a sort of slightly different take on that. And I can tell that the demand topic is going to be a particularly interesting one already. Like to introduce and welcome now Claire McNamara from the Broadband Stakeholder Group. And Claire, can you give us some of your thoughts, please?
Certainly, thanks, Matt, and thanks to Huawei and Assembly for a really interesting and timely report on Gigabit. All of us are living with completely new realities, and there are very few certainties. But I think, as we've all established, the need for sustained investment in very high capacity networks is unarguably one of those. So just a few reflections on relevance of some of those recommendations that Matt has sent out in the current context. So I think the first thing, which I think is encouraging actually and has already been referenced, is that I think what we've seen in the last month or so is a real sense of common purpose and collective action. So I think the effective mobilization of industry, of government, and of Ofcom around the need to sustain critical parts of the economy, and in particular the packages in support of the NHS, of vulnerable customers, and of the more latterly on online education, I think gives a sense of optimism that where there is the right coalition of interests and collective endeavour, actually a lot can be achieved pretty quickly. So I think that's a point of encouragement. I think the second point, which others have referred to, is around capacity and resilience. And much has been said already about it's all going to fall over. It won't cope with such surges in demand across the networks. 6 months of traffic for some mobile operators overnight. And really the networks have scaled up very effectively and shown themselves to be resilient and reliant. But this, of course, further underlines the urgency to ensure that the networks are future-proofed for future demand, and provisioning of gigabit networks is what we need to underline. And I think the third point that I would make is around customer expectations. So whether consumers, businesses, or parliamentarians working virtually across video conferencing, a new experience for a great number of us. I think one thing is clear on that, and that is that expectations are going to rise. So the longer we find ourselves in this pandemic situation, which could be for a considerable period of time, I think the greater those expectations are going to be particularly around quality of service. So it really is evident in already some of the feedback that's kind of coming back through those different media. So I think that further makes the case for, the accelerated provisioning of both fixed mobile and wireless networks in support of that. So we need that ultra resilient, high speed and low latency, and we need to be very mindful that the expectations of customers are probably going to exceed the pace of delivery of some of those future networks. So I think it's a really interesting period of time that we're in at the moment, and look forward to the rest of the debate. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. Now I'd like to ask Belinda Fawcett to give us some couple of words from CTIL. I think most people will probably know what CTIL is, Belinda, but maybe you want to just explain for those who aren't aware of the infrastructure divide that sits behind the mobile operators that we probably all know a little bit better.
Yeah, absolutely. Good afternoon, everyone. Cornerstone, or CTIL, as we're often referred to, we are a joint venture company set up between Vodafone and O2. We've set up in 2012, basically to operate and manage the mobile infrastructure for both our shareholders. We do have other sharers on our sites, but primarily they are our two main customers. I think, listening to what everyone else has been saying, it's very interesting to hear different views. And I think what has come out, what stood out for me is, I think somebody mentioned that the industry are standing ready to achieve this target, but we do need some of the barriers removed to help and support this. I think definitely over the last few weeks that has become ever more critical, ever more important, as we see how much connectivity is required to keep the country going. I think from my perspective, what are the biggest barriers? And I think, that's where I probably want to focus what I'm saying is, and I think one of the biggest barriers that we have is the relationship between the operators and the landowner community. And this really sort of impacts from a planning perspective, but also from a deployment perspective. So Cornerstone, obviously, we are deploying the network infrastructure for both Vodafone and Telefonica, and actually maintaining that. So obviously a big part of our remit is to find new sites, both to enhance the network, but to obviously carry out replacement sites where we lose them. So the government, I think, addressed this in 2017, and I'm sure everyone knows about the legislation that was introduced then, which was the Electronic Communications Code. And there's been a huge amount of discussion, debate, conferences over the last 2.5 years. But I think what's happened is that this new legislation has actually radically changed the relationship between landowners and network operators, and not necessarily for the better. The purpose of the legislation was to promote and encourage the rollout of digital communications across the 5G, everything that we're all talking about now. And of course, the current pandemic has only served to reinforce that. But 2.5 years on, where are we? It's very clear that the code isn't working as it was intended. And I think that the net effect translates as a hindrance to the current levels of activity that we require. Basically, the UK landowner community is unsupportive of the new legislation, very suspicious of its underlying intentions, and their attitudes are frequently seen as being disruptive to any form of constructive dialogue that we want to have with them, and very much the intention is to delay or deter our activities wherever possible. So has the barrier busting teams made a difference? Someone again mentioned that earlier. I don't think they've gone far enough, and I think a very sort of a key debate is what else needs to be done, because if this isn't fixed, if we can't find a way forward, I believe it will have a serious impact on our ability from a mobile perspective to actually reach the targets that the government have set. And we will not get the ubiquitous coverage that we all need. It's absolutely critical. It's slowed down rollout. The new legislation has actually slowed down the rollout rather than made it quicker. And we're reliant on tribunals taking cases to tribunal, which is taking far too long. We're not getting sometimes the answers that they want, that the operators need. Not saying that they're fair, but it's a piece of legislation where there are an awful lot of grey areas, and we need those points clarified. We need the government to now step in and clarify, some of these points which are really causing some areas of dispute, I think, in negotiations. And that's, I think, one of the sort of critical points that we need, as well as for the government to take a leadership role and actually help us to, by actually opening up the government estate and the public estate for the use by the operators. So I think that's probably enough from me. I know we've run out of time, but I think that's where my focus is at the moment in terms of trying to remove those barriers.
Thank you very much, Belinda. That's great, and tees us up quite well. So we're now going to move on to the panel session of this event. Slightly complicated because not everyone will be sort of in the right panel order. Bear with us. So on the panel we have Matt Howett, Alex Blowers, Simon Mead, Claire McNamara and Belinda Fawcett, who you've just heard from. Panelists, what I'd ask is if you can stay on mute, and then if you want to come in, and then you can sort of unmute yourself, and I can call you that way, so that rather than pass the proverbial mic down the row, that's how we'll try and manage it for this one. So I will get on to the questions that are starting to come through in the chat, but I guess to kick us off, we've talked a lot about the economic impact at the macro level, GDP. For those local communities, what does it mean at sort of the more local level for the local communities, local towns? Alex, maybe some of those constituencies that you were talking about. What does full fibre and 5G, that gigabit connectivity, mean for them? And sort of, what type of benefits can they start to realise as soon as it's being deployed?
So, Matt, I think the examples that we've seen so far, I think probably fall into three categories. So, local authorities tend to start with getting better, wanting to have more reliable and resilient connectivity to their existing estate. So that's the near-term driver for wanting to see a major uplift in the connectivity provided. But the more forward-thinking local authorities are starting to plan well beyond their immediate connectivity needs and start thinking about things like smart city applications, yoking together all the different constituent parts of the local, shall we say, public sector estate, so schools and hospitals and GP surgeries, as well as their own local authority buildings. And I think, to be honest, the COVID-19 crisis has been a great proving point of the kinds of things that you can do if you have reliable connectivity in place. So telemedicine, which has been the kind of Cinderella of our industry, you know, for those of us who've been around as long as I have, I can remember people talking up the prospects of telemedicine 20 years ago when broadband was still first becoming a real thing. But the reality is that the connectivity has never been reliable enough to really make telemedicine a practical proposition. And now we're starting to see some GP surgeries and local health centres adopting that in this crisis for the first time ever, and starting to understand both its potential but also the limitations of what they can and can't do using the technology available to them right now. Smart city applications more generally are sometimes a bit more controversial. So there's a debate running at the moment about the extent to which mass connectivity equals mass surveillance. And I'm really going to sidestep that discussion for this purpose. I mean, I would just say that, you know, there are so many no-brainer applications of smart city tech, like traffic management, like being able to plan and execute the delivery of public services such as refuse collection, etc. That I think in a way, you know, you can argue about the specifics of smart city applications, but I think everybody's increasingly recognizing that there's a lot that we can do to make our cities more livable and more efficient in the way that they deliver our kind of economic and social life. And actually, that's starting to really resonate with some local authorities right now. And then I think the third thing is, particularly for areas, you know, one of the things that sits behind this debate is the massive economic inequalities that exist within the UK between different regions. And one of my hobby horses is that, you know, we've gone from a situation where historically we had a very active regional policy to essentially having not much of a regional policy at all. I think we're now seeing a shift in the government's attention towards regional policy being a much more important component part of the government's overall economic story. And one of the things that we strongly believe, profoundly believe as an organisation, is that the first and best real economic uplift, and I'd be interested to know how strongly this is reflected in Assembly's report, is the way that SMEs in particular can be much more effective in exploiting economic opportunities if they actually have cheap, reliable connectivity. So actually, I think the potential upsides are less about top-down directed activity and more about bottom-up economic activity, using enhanced connectivity to find new ways of working, new ways of reaching customers, new ways of being a smart distributed organisation that simply haven't been available to us up to now. So I think that's the other big component part of this, and actually the one in kind of GDP terms, which probably has the biggest contribution.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Would any of the other panelists like to jump in on that point?
Matt, are we able to share screens?
We have actually locked it for this.
No problem. So I think when we're talking sort of locally here, there's a really interesting project that 5G Rural Dorset pulled together about how they saw connectivity transforming the county. And there are some really local issues here, because one is they're a World Heritage Site, you know, pretty much the whole of the place with the Jurassic Coast, and so digging things up and putting masts in is a real challenge for them. But they saw the benefits to them as a region around about connectivity and logistics and traffic planning and management of tourism traffic through the summer and how they could use 5G and connectivity to manage that. They look at areas of their economy that they think will benefit as a result of it. They've got a very disparate healthcare network, which they wanted to try and bring together. Public safety around their beaches and the traffic again during the summer, leading into how they manage their tourists. So there's some really interesting things that they're looking at. And the other area is the environment. If they can reduce things, if they can reduce car travel, or if they can make it smoother, then for them, their environmental conditions improve dramatically. And I think one of the areas that are one of the problems that they face, and I think Belinda, you raised this as well, which is about who owns what. And it's not necessarily with Dorset, but with York City Council. I've got a really interesting project around how they're trying to make York a smart city. Biggest problem they face is who owns the street furniture. Where can they actually deploy things? So they're looking at a small cell scenario, and they're actually really struggling to get the coverage they need because other people own all the buildings. They own the optimum sites within the city of York. And that as a pattern, if you take small cell deployment as an example, if you look across the globe, the areas where you have the most or the highest density of small cell networks, Far East, generally Japan, South Korea, China, and that's because they have either different planning regulations or they have no planning regulations, or things are owned by the state. If you take that the other way and you look at the US, where I think the US has the lowest deployment, that's actually because the operators of the people that own the street furniture, and they own the lamps and the street lamps, they're all private organizations, and so they're charging. They're charging people to deploy the network. So it's an additional, if you're paying $300 a lamppost to have one of your sensors on it, it builds it up. So I think Belinda touched on it, but I think it's a real barrier to how these technologies can be deployed.
Well,
Yeah,
sorry, Matt, go on.
Maybe, Matt. Yeah, because we'd looked at quite a few of those things as part of the final section of the report, which was looking at how people are actually using this. And I think, we tried to include some of the serious things that we've seen around healthcare, particularly in China, in response to the pandemic. But some of the ones which often get overlooked, and I think tie in neatly with a couple of those points, were around live and social events. And these are where, when we're all allowed to go back outside and be social, quite often you can find people wanting to, play multiplayer games with their smartphones. Initially it was Pokemon Go, but there are a whole load of others now. And you've actually seen in some parts of Asia, cities coming and competing with each other to host these kind of events. And so, you need to have that infrastructure in place in order for your town or your city to host these events, which then bring, additional revenue to local businesses. So some of that stuff is covered off in our use cases.
Thanks, Matt. Could I just come in on the back of that? Just wanted really just to call out that part of the role of the broadband stakeholder group as a leading advisory group into government on behalf of the broadband value chain is really to commission pieces of research that might shed some light on issues such as the impact of full fibre and 5G on the local economy. And I think we all recognise that local authorities are very constrained in terms of their resources and their budgets. So what we did was to commission Auxera Economic Consultancy to look at a framework really as a model for how local authorities should consider the practical aspects and the outcomes that they want to achieve from such investment. Now we all know that it's reasonably nascent in terms of some of the projects and use cases that come out of that. A few of those have been mentioned. And in fact, they also cited the Liverpool Telecare, which was a really good one, as well as Putting Rural First in Orkney, which looked at agri-tech and a number of other areas, which really brought together a more holistic view of what those benefits could be. But in general, what they did highlight was it really does depend on where you sit on that spectrum of semi-rural or semi-urban or predominantly urban or predominantly rural. And I think it just really provides a template that local authorities can look to assess what are the outcomes that they want to achieve and what are the steps that they need to take in order to realise those outcomes. And with the research that's done and the evidence that has been supplied back on that, in terms of businesses, you know, there is definitely evidence of the benefits to local authorities in terms of increased economic activity, for public service delivery, taking the cost out of public service delivery, as well as wider societal benefit. But yeah, there are many ways to achieve this, but I think it also needs to be borne in mind where you sit in terms of your particular geographical circumstances, the density of businesses, and also the availability and take-up metrics that apply to your local areas.
Matt,
Great.
it's Linda. Can I just feed something back? And just really touching on Simon's point, absolutely agree with him in terms of the local authorities. And some of them are very forward thinking, definitely want that connectivity, definitely see the advantages of it. You've got the West Midland 5G group as an example of, you know, how closely they were working with us to try and get connectivity in their areas. However, I still think that one of the problems is that there is still this concept of what's best value. And so there's still this idea of trying to get best value in monetary terms from maybe the infrastructure that is needed to actually facilitate all this connectivity. And I think what we are trying to do is the best value is actually maximization of the value of that connectivity, the economic benefits that it will bring. And I don't think that message has got through yet. And so what's actually stopping a lot of these local authorities from actually supporting this critical infrastructure is this concern about what's best value. You know, will the electorate, will the communities object to the fact that we go down this code valuation, may not be as much as previously we got. And so everyone's terrified of taking that step forward to actually realise what the legislation says. I think if we could get this idea, and I think Claire touched on it, it's about the value of the connectivity, the economic benefits, which are huge. And I think as an industry, it's something we need to spend more time working on, and actually to even the private individuals, not just the local authorities, it's getting those private individuals to really understand what this is going to deliver for them.
Can I chip in there, Matt?
Yes, by all means.
Yeah, so I think you're right, Belinda, and I think it makes you question how much of the story and how much of the benefit I think the public are very capable of understanding the other benefits that the full fibre or the 5G network will bring. And so, if you just consider the two kind of key deliverables around latency and capacity, being able to support 1 million devices over a 5 square kilometre block, for example, we whinge about not being able to get coverage. But you can get that story over to the people. The ability to then be able to adopt VR and AR to enhance education and training, comes into it. To talking about actually being essential to the progress and the development of self-driving cars and autonomous vehicles and the subsequent benefit to the environment of that. I think from the operator's point of view, you've got the diversity of the offerings that they can bring in. Through network slicing, I think that's something that people could understand. How that then allows the networks and the operators to develop business cases around smart cities, around IoT in factories, around with connected cars, and developing networks as a service. And I think we only ever focus on speed for consumers. We don't tell the general public. And perhaps we don't tell, and perhaps the politicians don't get this across, all of the other benefits that will come to industry if we can do this.
Great, thank you for that, Simon. I'm going to ask everyone to keep their answers a little bit shorter now, so that we can start to address this. But we did touch on demand quite a lot during everyone's speaking slots, and Peter has asked both a question, and I'm not sure whether he's answered it in his follow-up comment, but he did say sort of why is it with the current high numbers of homes passed in countries like Spain and France that telcos seem to be having a bit of a problem selling the story to customers. So I think this goes to Matt's point in the report recommendation about demand side stimulus rather than focusing on putting fibre in the ground and 5G antenna onto towers. And it's come up a couple of times as well. So I guess, where can we shortcut some of this adoption from other countries is probably a question for a couple of the panelists. We've all gone quiet now.
I'll take myself off mute. It's a really great point, because as Matt says, we've all been about how can we deploy the network, what are the barriers, and how to get cracking with all of those things. And what we really need to understand better, and it is referenced in the report, there's some useful pointers in there about references to other countries. And I think what we really need to understand, what are those barriers to adoption? And I think Alex at the outset put his finger on really a couple of those, and it also speaks to the question there. And there are a number of things, a number of points of clarity for consumers. There is an awful lot of customer confusion out there, and that partly is because deployment of superfast, as we've just said, is very prevalent and nearly ubiquitous in some areas. So that has caused some of this confusion about what is available. But I think what we need to do is to get a greater body of evidence. So what we've just kicked off is some research across a number of different European countries, which builds on what's in the report, but it's really looking at those barriers. Is it around customer confusion? Is it around the kind of need for co-investment and collaboration in order to, with the approach build? Is it around labeling of products, as they've done in Italy and in France, for example, to make it clear for consumers? And is it about, the fixed copper migration and the ease of doing that, as to Alex's point, without making that a forced migration? So looking at 4 European countries and the learnings that might provide for the UK policy and regulatory regime, and we should get that back in the next month or so. So hopefully that will also contribute to the debate.
Thanks, Claire.
Matt, can I just chip in on this one as well? So, I mean, I agree with everything Claire said, really. I think it's also important to bear in mind that we are, in a sense, working to an artificial deadline imposed by the government, which is to complete this process, or get close to completing this process by 2025. And in a sense, that means that you have to start from an assumption that we are going to speed up what might be termed the natural rate of adoption. So those countries that are further out from us right now have generally got there by starting towards the end of the previous decade on a path of industry-led investment in full fibre, and consumers are now catching up with that, and actually adoption rates are going up. If we want to now short circuit the fact that we're behind everybody else and actually get ahead of everybody else, which I think is the government's stated intention, then I think we have to probably be a bit more holistic and manage the process a bit more tightly than might be our natural default setting. And what I mean by that is I think you can't just assume that this is an experienced good, right? So once people have had it, they're not going to switch back. But if we just leave it to word of mouth and people getting it after they've had it for a period of time, it never goes wrong. It's always reliable. It's got an infinite upgrade path, so I'll never actually need some dirty boots on site ever again. If we're going to kind of cut through that process of natural organic adoption of the technology, then we probably need to be a bit more top down in driving the messages through about the big upside for consumers of making this elective choice right now. So it's a kind of combination of persuasion and, kind of messaging, quite strong messaging, which I think for me is the logical complementary approach to all of the effort that's been put in to get the right supply side conditions. And it just really frustrates me that all the conversations that we tend to have with the regulator and with government, the consumer, who really at the end of the day are the people that we're doing this for, is always kind of left out of the conversation, which just seems all wrong to me.
I think everyone would probably echo that one, Alex. There's a specific question in the chat to Matt, I think, which is from Malcolm Corbett at Inca. Essentially, the issue around Area 3 and sort of providing, Ofcom providing regulatory support for BT Openreach. So, Matt, I'm not sure if you're in a position directly to answer that question, but
yeah, I mean, I can certainly share some thoughts. So, I mean, Area 3, for those not familiar with Ofcom's terminology, is that part of the country where probably you're not going to see any competition other than Openreach going in terms of deployment. And as such, in the market review, Ofcom have put in place what they consider the non-competitive area to be a different set of remedies. And here the idea is to sort of give Openreach more of an incentive to build and recover its costs. And there is still in this set of remedies a obligation to provide dark fiber for lease line use, so you can promote and support 5G, for example, in base stations. I mean, I think we do talk about the policy environment and the regulation to get to this point. I think we say that it's important that the regulation should vary geographically because it's going to look different in different parts of the country. I mean, we don't have obviously Openreach on the call to give exactly what they think about that specific set of remedies for Area 3, but I think there is sort of something in that market review for everyone in terms of giving them something to be happy about and something to grumble about. I guess Alex might have more of a thought specifically on what obligations are left for Openreach there.
Do you want me to come in on that point, Matt?
By all means, Alex. I know Ofcom Openreach tends to be a good question for you.
Well, I think Matt's correctly kind of identified that the Ofcom wants to adopt a different approach in different areas, and that makes sense from first principles. I think the concern is, my concern, and Malcolm's heard me say this before, is Ofcom's approach is basically declaring that final Area 3, let's call it the final third of the country because it's about 30% on their current assumptions, to be a for all time Openreach monopoly. Now, some of Malcolm's members in Inca, and even firms with the name City in the firm's title, actually are a bit concerned about that. And the reason for that is pretty simple. We don't yet know how far our economics will take us. We do know that the government's contemplating making quite large amounts of public money available to gap fund rollout in rural. I think it's a bit difficult right now to declare with certainty and effectively making it a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that 30% of the country will only ever see network deployment from the incumbent. So that's my philosophical concern about that approach. My view is that the government's policy, as I understand it, is to make as much of the country a contestable investment opportunity as possible. And I worry that what Ofcom is doing is prematurely foreclosing the possibility for Malcolm's members in Inca, for firms like City Fibre, your GigaClears, your Hyperoptics, and a whole bunch of others, coming up fast on the rails, to also have a crack at that rural final third. I don't see that inevitably has to just be handed over to the incumbent, who, by the way, as I understand it, doesn't particularly want that either.
point on the latter one. I'm sure if Openreach were here, they could share some more of their thoughts in that case. But just to move us on, as they aren't, my personal view is the 2025 target is extremely useful. It helps you and us as an industry win more arguments in government, because all sort of public policy decisions are ultimately a balancing act, between digging up the road and traffic congestion. If we have that sort of firm overriding belief that full fibre is certainly a build it once infrastructure, that 5G is certainly such a step change from what has come before it. What are the individual barriers or policy regulatory levers, just one from each of the panel, that you would like to see government or the regulator utilise to help us to get to 2025? So it's not quite what's the silver bullet to get us there, because I think we're all been on panels like this long enough to know that there isn't truly one single silver bullet, but what is the one that you think would make the most difference and help us get that ramp of deployment as high as possible over the next 12 to 18 months? So that's a little bit more about, but Matt, I'm going to throw you slightly under the bus here, given that you've just written a report and had plenty of time to think about this. Yeah. So what do you think would sort of be that one initiative if you had that power?
I mean, I think the thing which came through quite a lot with the stakeholder interviews that we did is that, the government sort of give with one hand and then take away with the other. And the point that many people spoke about were business rates as being a good example of that. They want to see fibre deployed. They want to hit this target by 2025. Yet, the whole industry grumbles about the fact that new fibre is taxed in a way differently as well across the UK. Scotland has a bigger exemption for business rates than England and Wales do currently. I think they want to see that extended and ideally completely removed. Openreach, for example, they're not here, but they did say that they could probably connect about 3 million more homes if they didn't have to pay that tax. So I think really my sort of recommendation is to get government thinking more joined up about what it's sort of trying to do on one hand and incentivizing on the other.
Great, thank you for that, Matt. Alex, if I can come to you next.
So I'm not going to, all the other things that other people will mention, I probably agree with. But the one I'm going to specifically call out is duct and pole access. So a key component of the government's approach and also Ofcom's regulatory strategy is to make duct and pole access work to deliver both faster deployment and significant cost savings on deployment. And I think this has been prematurely moved into the job done, tick in the box category, because our experience as the largest individual user of duct and pole access remains pretty unsatisfactory. Certainly we're not seeing anything like the savings that were promised, and it's also a bit of an uphill struggle to actually get it to work in the way that was intended. So, before we start thinking about maybe other challenges to come, I'd really like to see completion on the promise of what we were, the promise that was made on duct and pole access.
Great, thanks, Alex. That's an important reminder of DPA. Simon, can we come to you next?
Yeah, I think the biggest roadblock will be, so if we think about it at the moment, I think we're about 1.2 million homes a year are getting connected. So that means that you're going to have to up that to at least 3 million if we're going to reach 29 million homes by 2025. So the deployment rate needs to increase rapidly. So we're going to hit labour shortages and the right skilled workers to do that job. So I think that means that there is no choice but for the operators to collaborate more. And I think that that inevitably leads us to some sort of technology neutrality. And I think that's probably the biggest roadblock for me.
What you were going to say, competition law there, which was going to open up a whole new can of worms. But...
I wouldn't be that daft
Yeah.
at this point of the conversation.
Claire, can we come to you next?
Yeah, sure. I don't want to anticipate what Belinda's going to say, but she has already mentioned access to land, and clearly absentee landlords is one that has been a perennial and will only become more acute in this current crisis. But I guess we all agree on all of them, right? They're perennials. New build needs to get cracking on that. But I think potentially one of the ones that we need to kind of addresses the consistency across the piece. So we all know that even when the right legislation and policy is in place, it is a consistency of application of the policy. And particularly that relates, I think, to highways authorities, that we'd all agree. So I think there is a greater role for industry, central government barrier busting team and local authorities to really drive best practice in that. And this is as much lays at the feet of, I think, of operators in terms of their consistency of approaches as well as it is to local authorities. That's probably the one I'd call out. Thanks.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Belinda, a view from the wireless sector in particular.
Yeah, look, I mean, what everyone has said, particularly Claire, absolutely, I agree with. I mean, what I wrote down was, I think, government to walk the talk. I mean, they say all this stuff, they've set this strategy, they've set this policy, they've set this target. So, and I think, as I alluded to earlier, we need them to take a leadership role in this. We need them, all these public bodies, government, the NHS Trust, the MOD, the government own a huge amount of land across the UK, local authorities, and they need to be forced to do these deals to enable us to get this infrastructure there. Unless we do that, the private sector won't follow suit. So until we see enough being done in the public sector. And, we really need we need to take a step forward, a really big step forward on this, because otherwise we're just not going to hit that 2025 target.
I think you've probably made the highlights reel with government needs to walk the talk with that, Belinda. So thank you very much. And thank you all for participating in this afternoon's webinar. Particular thanks, of course, to Matt Howett, Assembly and Huawei for such an important report, but also to our panelists and to Sophie Weston at techUK, who's been organising this. Obviously, we can't give thanks in the time-honoured usual fashion. So if you go to your reactions button, Zoom, and clap, you can give thanks in sort of the new world that we live in any case. And I look forward to seeing you all on a Zoom or a Teams meeting indeed, or any other such platform very shortly. Have a great afternoon. Thank you very much.